The Notorious Jumping Frog by Mark Twain from The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine, who wrote from me from the East, I called on a good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is in fact a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I had noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me a good day. I told him that a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood, named Leonidas W. Smiley. Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair. Then he sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed the flow of his voice from that gentle flowing key to which he turned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which he showed me plainly, that, so far from him imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on his own way, and I never interrupted him once. Reverend W. Reverend Lee, well, there was this feller here once, by the name of Jim Smiley, in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recall exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one or the other is because, I remember the big flume weren't built yet when he first come to the camp. But anyway, he was the curious man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see, if he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if it couldn't be changed sides. Anyway, that was what suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he got a bet, so he was satisfied that he could bet. But he was still lucky, uncommonly lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and lying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned, but that feller to offer to bet on it. Take any side you please, as I was just telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on that. If there was two birds sitting on a fence, you would bet on which one would leave first. Or if it was a camp meeting, he would bet on the regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best extorter about here. And he was too and a good man. If he even saw a straddlebug start to go anywheres, he would bet you on how long it would take him to go, and to wherever he was going. And if you took him up on it, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico. But what he would find out where he was bound and how long he was on the road for. Lest of the boys here was seen that Smiley, and you could tell about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. The darndest fella. Parson's wife laid very sick once, for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her, but one morning he come in, and Smiley up and asked how she was, and he said she was considerable better. Thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'd risk 2.5 she don't anyway. This here Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag. But that was only in fun, because of course she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse. For all she was slow, and all she always had that asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start, and then pass her away. But always at the end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate-like, and come cavorting and straddling up, and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, and sometimes out to one side, among the fences, and kicking up more dust and rising more racket, with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up the stand, just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a small bull pup, that to look at him you'd think he weren't worth a cent, but to sit around and look ornery, and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like there was the forecastle on a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him, and bullyrag him, and bite him, and throw him over a shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on, but when he was satisfied, he hadn't expected nothing else, and the bets began doubled and doubled on the other side all the time, till the money was all up. And then all of a sudden he would grab that other dog just by the bit of his hind leg and freeze onto it, not chew on it, you understand, but only just to grip and hang on till they throw up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always came out the winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that he didn't have no hind legs, because they'd never sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough, the money was still all up. He came to make a snatch for his pet Holt. He see in a minute how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he peered surprised, and then he looked sorta discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look, as much as he had to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting him up against that dog that ain't have no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. It was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have him made a name for himself if he had lived, for that was the stuff that was in him, and he had genius, I know it, because he hadn't had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he hadn't had no talent. It was always to make me feel sorry when I think of that last fight he is in, and the way it turned out. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kinds of things, till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day, and he took him home, and he had calculated to educate him, so he'd never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learn that frog to jump, and you bet he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, if he had a good start, and come down flat-footed, all right, like a cat. He got him up in such a matter of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he couldn't do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down on his floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and he sang out, "Flies, Daniel, flies," and quicker you could wink he'd spring right up and snake a fly off the counter there, and flop down on the floor again, as solid as a glob of mud. and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot so indifferent as if he hadn't had no idea he'd been doing any more than a frog should do. You never see a frog so modest and so straightforward as he was. For all he was so gifted, and when it came to fair and square jumping on dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on dead level was his strong suit, you understand. When it came to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well, he might be, for fellows had traveled and been everywheres, as all he said he laid over any frog they'd ever see. Well, Smiley kept that little beast in a little lattice box. He used to fetch him down town sometimes and lay for a bit. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box, and he says, "What might that be in that box you've got there?" And Smiley says, sorta indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary. Maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, and he looked at it careful, and turned it round this way and that, and says, "So 'tis. What's he good for, then?" "Well," Smiley says, very deliberate-like, "he's good for one thing. I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and he took another long, particular look, and he gave it back to Smiley, and he says, "Well," he says, "I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you don't understand frogs. Maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've got experience. And maybe you ain't only a mature, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then he says, kinda sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, That's all right. If you hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box, and he put up his $40 along with Smiley's and set it down to wait. So he sat there a good while, thinking to himself. And then he got the frog out. He prized his mouth open, took a teaspoon, and he filled him full of quail shot. Filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog, and fetched him in, and give him to this feller, and he says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside Daniel, with his 4 paws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give you the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get. And him and the feller touched up on the frogs behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Daniel gave a heave. He hoisted his shoulders up, so like a Frenchman, but it weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as church. He couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money, and he started away, and when he was going out at the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "So, Daniel," and he says again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no point about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in tarnation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel by the nape of his neck, and hefted him, and he says, "Why, blimey, my cats, if he don't weigh 5 pound." And he turned him upside down, and he belched out a handful of buckshot. And then he see how it was. He was the maddest man, and he set that frog down, and he took out after that fella, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and he got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he says, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond James Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. Well, this here Smiley had a yeller, one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, just a short stump like a banana, and however, lacking both the time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but I took my leave instead. Thanks for reading The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County with me. I will see you next time.